Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So I'm back on the radio after spending the last 3 weeks working on the provincial campaign, and I ran as a candidate for the None of the Above party in Mississauga Lakeshore, and I wasn't successful. But I want to talk a little bit about the experience. I also want to talk about what I learned. And what I think we all learned from the provincial election. And I think that a lot of the arguments that I was making that there was something wrong with democracy in the election really proved itself out in the unbelievably low turnout. So the turnout was 43%. 57% of Ontarians that were eligible to vote didn't even bother showing up in the polls. Lowest turnout in Ontario history, second lowest turnout in Canadian history. And during the election, I was saying that if it was 55% turnout, it would be a travesty, and it was actually 43%. And you work out the numbers. The conservatives, the progressive conservatives, won 83 seats, 40.8% of the popular vote, with only 43% of the population turning out. So they only got 17.5%, 17.5% of the voters to vote for them. And with that, they get a strong majority of 83 seats, which is 67% of all the seats, more than 2/3 of all the seats in the legislature, with only 17.5% of the people in Ontario voting for them. Only 40% of the people that actually voted, of the 43% that voted. It's not right. It just doesn't seem like democracy. And there's a couple of other things about it that I want to talk about that just don't make sense to me. So the Liberals and the Conservatives got almost the exact same vote, 23.7% for the NDP, 23.8% for the Liberals. And yet the NDP got 25 seats and the Liberals got 6 seats. And so therefore, a Liberal voter actually counted for 1/4 of the value of an NDP voter. Think about that. And a conservative voter counted for 1.6 of every other voter, and counted for 7 times what a Liberal voter was worth. A conservative voter, because of the way that they won in different areas with just a very small marginal victory in a first past the post, a conservative voter was equal to almost 7 times, 6.7 times what a Liberal voter was worth. If you actually thought that a conservative vote was worth 6 times, almost 7 times what a Liberal vote was worth, would you think we'd have a democracy? Do you think we'd have one person, one vote? We don't. And you know what? The Greens won 6% of the popular vote, but they only won 1 seat, which is only less than 1% of the seats. And so therefore, they were about 10% of all the votes that they deserve, of the seats that they deserve. So they voted, their votes counted for 10% what a average voter would work, and 1/15 of what a conservative voter. So it would take 15 Green votes to equal 1 conservative vote in seat power. Think about that. Like it doesn't seem right. There's something wrong with the system. And so what I was arguing when I was running was that we needed to change our democracy into something that was more like a direct democracy. And I argued for proportional representation. Proportional representation means that people would get seats in the House equal to the percentage of the votes that they received. And so therefore, in this situation, what would have happened is that the Conservatives would have got 40% of the seats, and the Liberals and the NDP each would have got 23% of all the seats. And the Liberals and the NDP would have had 46% put together. The NDP would have had 6% together. So they would have had over 54%, 52%. And the Conservatives would have had their 40% of the seats. I think that's democracy. I think that's the way it should actually work. Some people will say the biggest problem with the proportional representation is that it'll be more difficult for you to have majority governments. And people will have to learn to work together. They'll have to talk to each other. They'll have to compromise. They'll have to collaborate. They'll have to work on policies together. I think that's a great thing. I don't understand why anyone could think that that's not a good thing. I also think that referendum would be a very effective tool. And 50 countries in this world have referendum. They work. Important decisions in Canada, we've used referendum. We've admitted that that's the best way to decide a really important decision, whether it be Quebec separation or change of the electoral system in Ontario. I don't understand why we can't have referendums more often. And when you think about the way that we do our taxes online, that we bank online, that we do so much online, we could have a online referendum system, census online, where maybe not absolutely every little bill, but the major important bills we get to vote on. The last thing that I thought was really wrong is there was no attention to the local candidate. Local candidates, or very little attention to local candidates. It really has become all about the leader. It really was Doug Ford versus Andrew Horwath versus Stephen Del Duca. And there were very few, if any, ridings that you bucked a trend. The Conservatives won the Conservative seats. The Liberals held on to the Liberal seats, and the NDP won the NDP seats. There was very few places where a local candidate changed things much, which means I think that we really aren't voting for our local representative. You really wonder why the MPPs are there. All they are is running on the coattails of the leader and the brand of the party. And I don't think that's right. And if we had a system where we voted for the premier or the prime minister separate from the local member, you ended up having a decision where if you had a really good local member that was a Green Party candidate versus that you really wanted the Liberals or the Conservatives to run the government, you could make that decision. We do that in municipal elections where we vote separately for a mayor versus a councillor versus a trustee. And yes, the turnout for the lower down ballots positions end up being less than the higher ballot positions. So more people vote for mayor than vote in the election for councillor. But so be it. If that's what people choose to do, that's what they choose to do. And I think it would be a great thing. It works in the United States where presidents are elected separately from Senate and Congress. It works in states where governors are elected separate from the people that are the representatives in the local state legislatures. I don't understand why we can't do it. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And it would mean that the local representatives really are representatives. You think about just the news that's covered in the United States, where a senator that can be a maverick can really play a difference because he's not doing whatever he's told to by the prime minister, or the premier, or the whip. He or she ends up having a point of view. That's what politics should be about, where you've got people that can have points of view rather than just being, lapdogs for the premier, the leader, the prime minister, or the whip. And so I think that that's really a key issue. And then, the last thing that I talked about quite a bit was recall. I don't think we have a discipline such that politicians that aren't doing their job can be recalled. The only discipline that is out there is when the leader of the party kicks them out of caucus. And frankly, I think that happened maybe too many times in the last legislature, where Ford kicked out several members from the caucus. And the concerning thing is that none of them won. Actually, one did, as an independent one that was recommended by a conservative, former conservative member that disagreed with the choice of the Conservative Party and the leader. But other than that, none of the people that were kicked out of the caucus won. And again, it's because it's so difficult for a local representative, a local candidate, to do anything to buck the trend of what's going on with the leader and the party. So I think there really is a weakness in our democratic system. And this election, almost more than any other election, proved it out, where you had, as I said, a conservative vote worth 7 times, 6 and a bit times what a Liberal vote was worth, and an NDP vote worth more than 4 times what a Liberal vote was worth. Like, you think about it, a Liberal voter versus a NDP voter, the NDP voter going into the ballot box elects effectively has a power equal to 4 Liberal votes. And a conservative has the power of 16 voters versus a Green voter. Like, there's something wrong there, and we've got to change it. We no longer have a system of one person, one vote, and we got to change it. I'm convinced of that. The second thing I'd like to talk about is my experience as being a candidate. I had a real interesting time of going door to door, going to some all candidates meetings, being interviewed, etc. And, you know, it's interesting because I had a very positive experience in the people I met and talked to and was interviewed by, and a very positive experience on the debates. People listened to me and they agreed with what I had to say. I had an unbelievable amount of people that said that the arguments that I was making, both for reform of democracy, but also my concerns on the policy issues, which I'll come to in a minute, they agreed with me. But then they all said, probably completely reasonably, that because I wasn't running for a main party, I didn't have a chance. To which I retorted, but you should be voting for the person that you think best can represent you, not just for the main party. And they didn't do that in the end. And so what it does, again, is it shows, I think, that even if you have really good people, and I'd like to believe I was good, but maybe not really good, if you have good people running, it doesn't matter. People vote because that's what we end up voting for, is the leader in the party, not for the local representative. Even if people agree with what you're saying, even if people like your experience, even if people like the policies that you stand for, even if they think you did a good job in the debates, even if they met you at the door and they said, you know, you're fantastic, we want you to be there. In the end, the local candidate is almost meaningless. It's all up to who the leader is. Which brings me to the third thing, is I do think that we had a real problem. You know, you think about it, the turnout went down dramatically. And so if you look at the absolute numbers, almost the same number of Liberal voters came out this time as came out in the worst debacle of the Liberal Party in history 4 years ago. So the Liberals didn't grow their vote. They grew their popular vote only because the number of voters in total went down. The Conservative vote went down dramatically, but because the total number of voters went down and because of splits, they increased their popular vote and increased their seats. And the NDP vote went down. So, you know, the number of people that went out and voted for Andrea Horwath last time, 4 years ago, went down to the number of people that voted for her this time. What does it say? It says that I think all the party leaders had some problems. Now, maybe the front runner campaign that Doug Ford ran didn't excite people. And so therefore, and people thought he was going to win because they were doing it on the percentages. And so therefore people stayed home. And so maybe for Doug Ford, that was the right tactical strategy, even though I think it long-term is a terrible strategy for democracy. Clearly, Stephen Del Duca didn't resonate with the populace, but also Andrea Horwath didn't. And both of them resigned on election night. But what does that say if you've got a situation where of the 3 leaders, none of them really excited anybody? It says that we're not getting people in politics that are going to motivate people to come out. And you think about the last couple of federal elections in both Canada and the United States. You know, Justin Trudeau in his first election dramatically increased turnout with young people and minority people. And I've done these statistics and lots of people have talked about them. If the same people came out in the 2019 election that had come out in the prior election, Stephen Harper would have won against Trudeau and he would still have been Prime Minister of Canada. But a whole bunch of new people, I think it was 3 million or something, extra people, I can't remember the exact number, but it was a substantial number of extra people came out and voted in that 2019 election. And that elected Justin Trudeau. But it didn't survive 4 years later. And the turnout and the absolute numbers went down. Barack Obama in his first election dramatically increased the turnout, so he excited people. But 2 years later, it went down, and 4 years later, it went down. And then 8 years later, it went down even further, such that if Hillary Clinton had excited people comparable to Barack Obama, she would have won handily over Trump, even though she did win the popular vote. So either you've got to believe in mandatory voting if you really want to have a democracy that works, or you've got to have a system where we elect leaders that end up exciting people and motivating people. And I think both these issues, both with the leadership elections as well as the nominations of the local candidates, are to a large extent negatively impacted by our system here rather than the system in the United States. What we have here is a nomination process for our local candidates, which is like run by a little club where people get together. You have to buy a membership or become a member. And it's one day, typically in one spot in the whole riding, where you got to come and you got to vote. There's no advanced pollings. There's not several polls. There's often long lineups. There's few members, a couple thousand people get to decide who the membership is. And that's after a green lighting review process by the party leadership as to whether you're actually allowed to run in the campaign. Compare that to the primary system in the United States. I was there in the United States, 2 weeks ago. Primary signs, election signs all over the place, run like an election campaign where there's an election day where there's voting stations all over the place. And similarly, as an election day, there weren't long lineups and people could efficiently vote. So not like a nomination in a typical Liberal Party nomination or Conservative Party nomination where the lineups can be atrocious and discourage people from voting. The primary system in the United States is democratic. I don't think the nomination system in Canada is democratic. In electing a leader, it's not as bad, but it's not a lot better. We end up having these big benchmark sets that you end up having to raise a certain amount of money. You have to pay a certain amount of money. You have to have a certain amount of electors before you can actually run. In the United States, if you want to run, you can run. Now, you're not going to get on the debate floor if you don't have a lot of support. And, in the last couple of election campaigns in the United States, people have been allotted time in the debates comparable to their percentage in the polls. And that, I think, is probably fair. And over the series of primaries in the United States, the field gets narrowed down such that in the end, it almost becomes a head-to-head. And that's probably a good system. I don't understand why we don't do that in Canada. One of the positives, I guess, about the Canadian system is it's all elected on one day, so every vote is exactly equal. But one of the positives about the U.S. system, primary system, is that you get like tests where you got Iowa and Vermont and other places that go early before you get to Super Tuesday, so that you get a sense of where the population is. And the field can narrow, which is comparable to the way that delegated conventions sort of used to happen, where there would be time between the first ballot, the second ballot, and the third ballot, such that you could see what the votes were, and people could strategize in between ballots. Where you do the preferential vote in the current leadership election process, you don't know. There's no time between the ballots. It's one ballot, one time across the country, and you just choose who you vote for first, second, third, fourth, fifth. I don't think our system works nearly as well. I think we got to rethink that. And I think the primary system that the United States has works better. And we should be thinking about whether that's a better system to follow. I think that it could be run by the electoral commissions in the provinces or the federal government, such that there's lots of polling stations and it happens across the ridings. I think that anyone should get to run if they want to run, and it should be up to the people whether they think it's appropriate that they be there rather than the party leaders and the party brass. And I think that no incumbent should be protected. And that's part of the problem, is that often leaders will protect the incumbents. And I think they should be forced to run just as much as anyone else has to run. So I think that that's a real issue with our system. The final thing that I wanted to really address is that I think there were a lot of issues that were not talked about in the election campaign. Fiscal sustainability, I think, is an issue. Potential of an upcoming recession is a real issue. We have debt to GDP that is atrociously high, and the former Minister of Finance, Federally Monod, came out, the day after the election and started talking about it from a federal standpoint. We needed that conversation during the election campaign, and we didn't have it. Housing affordability, people touched on, but they didn't really address the base problems, which I think is government, both provincially and municipally, and lack of supply. Climate change really didn't come up. The Green Party tried hard, but it wasn't a major issue, and I think it needed to be. Long-term care, we had this simplistic decision about or recommendation that we only allow private long-term care rather than only allow public long-term care rather than private long-term care, which I think there was no justification for. There's no proof that private was wrong and public was good in mortality statistics. It was HVAC systems. It was health and safety regulations and standards and the way they were implemented. And it was whether they had short-term contract workers versus full-time workers that wouldn't go back and forth and spread the virus from place to place. And I think the bottom line was that we didn't talk about how we're going to create prosperity, how we're going to improve productivity. There were so many issues that are critically important in Ontario that we didn't address in this election campaign. And I think it's a shame. It's a huge shame. And I hope we do better. Anyway, it was fun for me to run. I was frustrated that I didn't do better and that people didn't listen to me. But hey, that's politics, I guess. Thanks for listening to me. Good night.